what I'm here to talk to you all about is a $1 trillion opportunity. I don't think anyone else here today is offering a $1 trillion opportunity. So what does that look like? As Liz said, we've been doing some collaborative research between the Center for Health and Healthcare with the World Economic Forum and our organization to look at a few things. I'll say out front, this presentation uses the term women to mean cisgender women with individuals with female biology. We acknowledge the need for additional research and data for transgender communities and other non-binary communities, but today we will focus on a cisgender definition for women. What we did. Not a lot of data exists around the women's health gap today. So what our study looked at was over 650 papers covering 180 plus interventions for 64 conditions that represent about 90% of the global women's health burden. So all the facts that follow cover an extensive amount of quantitative data as well as supplemented with external expert perspective around disease burden for women. What does this mean? I'm about to do a little bit of a myth-busting session today. Myth number 1, women live longer than men, so they're healthier. Makes sense. What I will tell you though, this is not actually true. Women actually spend 25% more time in poor health than men. This is an incredible figure, and when you think about the impact of this, it is time spent less giving back to communities, spent less with their families, just generally having a life year quantity that is 25% lower than men. So sure, huge advancements made in kind of the overall lifespan for the entire population, but women actually spend a significant portion of that time more than men in poor health. Maybe I have you convinced there, but I can almost feel it. I can hear you thinking, okay, I believe you. Women spend more time in poor health, but that health gap must be concentrated at the end of life. Again, women live longer. It must be concentrated there at the end. Again, I think I'll continue to disprove these, but that's actually the opposite of what is true. About over half of the women's health gap impact women during their core working years, which significantly impacts global GDP. This burden, it prevents them from participating in the workforce, participating in families, and kind of just generally advancing the GDP overall, when a huge portion of the GDP advancement over the last century has been by women participating more in the global economy here. So 2 myths busted with me so far. The third myth, women's health is sexual and reproductive health. Now, Anila kind of dispelled a little bit of this early already, and I'll dig more into this. Maybe you're still thinking, I have you convinced, women do spend more time or less time in healthy living than men. It's not concentrated at end of life, but if it's working years, it must be kind of the reproductive related conditions that we associate with pregnancy and we associate with kind of the female organ body. Again, not true. Only about 5% of this women's health burden comes from diseases that are specific to women, so such as menopause, endometriosis, PCOS, some of the classic understood women-specific conditions here. Another 4% is related to conditions that impact women differently. Cardiovascular disease, among others. This is kind of a different manifestation of symptoms than what men would experience from that same disease. The bulk of the women's health burden comes from conditions that actually affect women disproportionately. This includes autoimmune diseases, this includes migraines, things that present in women more often than men, and though often much understudied relative to men. Using migraine as an example, women have at least times higher incidence of migraine than men. However, there are very few, if any, women-specific studies around migraine for women in particular here. The facts are there, right? A huge amount of this burden is not just the classic women's health conditions. It's really understanding the nature of the disease, behind what is impacting those women differently. Last myth here. Women's health is a niche market opportunity. Now, Aniela talked about the great investment coming into the marketplace. I think there has been a huge amount of momentum. I think the community, and the life sciences community in particular, may underestimate the true market potential here. So I'm sure those of you, especially those of you directly involved in life sciences, when I think about big therapeutic areas that come to mind, I'm sure the ones that pop up are immunology, oncology, diabetes. We all know those are the ones where the majority of the market spends. Putting that into perspective, though, if you think about the rate of endometriosis for women, 1 in 10 women have endometriosis globally. Based on the sizing of that market, that could put that market between $180 and $250 billion annually. That is right on par with what you see in some of these very well-studied, well-treated, and frankly, large markets here, like immunology, like oncology. And when you put that in perspective, I say 1 in 10 women have endometriosis. That's a very similar rate to the diabetes rate, 1 in 10 incidence rate there as well. Comparing the pipelines, there are about 20 assets for endometriosis in the pipeline, and most of those are for managing symptoms. Compared to the 580 plus assets in the pipeline for diabetes, arguably a class that's well understood, has options here and is now moving toward being a treatment of disease versus treatment of symptoms. There's a huge untapped potential, and we're thankful that there are investment firms and companies looking at closing this gap and making this a market that it should be based on the level of incidence that it presents. So what are the underlying reasons for this women's health gap? Maybe I've convinced you now that some of the myths that you perhaps walked into this room are not true. Women do not live healthier lives than men overall. That burden happens in the working years. It's concentrated in diseases that you wouldn't expect. And if someone invested, there's a ton of opportunity. Why haven't we gotten there, and why aren't we there today? So one huge portion is a limited understanding of sex-based differences. There has historically, and it's been brought up multiple times today, historically been a lesser focus on teasing out the manifestations in men and women in clinical studies across the board. It's also, part of this is also a manifestation of, back in the 70s, the FDA explicitly excluding women of reproductive age from early stage clinical trials out of risk aversion for the kind of potential downsides there. That lasted about 2 decades. And what that's left us with is 2 decades worth of time and information to catch up on to actually understand those sex-based differences. The ball is moving forward there today, but there is a lot of ground to make up for those 2 decades of lost information there. We can't talk about the burden of women's health without thinking about also the constrained access to sex-appropriate care. Women face challenges in their care journeys, in getting accessible treatment, in being diagnosed. Well-studied about, and Aniela had some great data this morning that showed similar comparable diseases of just the rate of diagnosis between men and women, and how much more often that is effectively that patient makes it to that diagnosis stage there and is able to make it to treatment. Third, data gaps resulting in the women's health burden being undercounted. This kind of goes hand in hand with the first one about the limited understanding. But in addition to the limited understanding, there aren't always the mechanisms to capture that data. Not every study will capture information about the nature of female versus male or compare those results in a way that enables an advancement of data around what those differences could be. Last, low investment limiting innovation. I'm sorry, low investment limiting scale of innovation. This is kind of one of those chicken or the egg or self-propelling cycles where the lack of funding kind of leads to a lower lack of funding, which leads to less understanding, leads to less new innovation, which kind of makes it hard to get that wheel jump started and really moving through the potential there. What could this mean? I promised you a $1 trillion opportunity here. When you look at the data and when you look at the manifestations of how this health burden plays out and what could happen, if you broke it out into a few different areas here, fewer health conditions, fewer earlier deaths, increase in productivity and expanded participation, adding these all up, you could add over $1 trillion to the incremental GDP by 2040. Now the number is huge, and that's a huge reason to address this issue here and now. So much more of that also comes down to the daily lives of yourself, your sisters, your daughters, your family members who are women. That is time they are spending in better health. That is time they are better able to to contribute to their communities, to contribute to their livelihoods. All of this is kind of a full opportunity, both from the GDP perspective as well as in a personal perspective. Thinking about a specific example, you might hear a little bit of my cough here. I've been battling this kind of 6-week cough that I can't kick. One example, asthma inhalers are actually not studied for women-specific differences. Again, another disease that has a different manifestation for women. So there's a rate that women actually experience these types of kind of lingering coughs or things like this and are unable to be treated as effectively as men. Now, I'll be honest, I just need to make it to another doctor's appointment to try to treat it a little better, but these specific kind of results of this impact every woman's daily life and can continue to impact their ability to live the healthiest life here. I have one more slide, and then we will have time for a few questions if there are any on the data or anything like that. What do we need to do? What can we do together? A big portion of this is increasing awareness of the women's health gap. I would be willing to bet that many of you or many of the folks around you would not realize some of the facts I told you today that I've talked about with the regards to health, what those diseases are, how that impacts women, and what the opportunity is. Increasing awareness builds momentum, it builds the conversation, it builds the pulse around what that could be like to really fix this as a collective life sciences and broader community here. Another action that must be taken, I mentioned it already, but enhancing the access to sex-appropriate care. Unblocking the access barriers that may prevent women from getting diagnosed, from getting treated, from getting appropriately treated, can help jumpstart this ability to close this gap here. Data. I spend a lot of my time at my job analyzing data, analyzing results of data, and using those to make big decisions. It's very hard for our innovators, for our funding mechanisms to make good decisions without the data to inform where to place those bets, where to go to look for treating women-specific conditions, and how to help women here. So systematically and a concerted effort on collecting and analyzing those sex and ethnicity, gender-specific data will make huge strides in closing that gap. Research gaps. I mentioned already just and we've talked about it throughout the day in different sessions, the focus or inclusion or exclusion of women from certain clinical trials from a risk-related reason for the health of that woman, but also to kind of control a variable for the pharma company. What this turns into is not understanding then how that is an independent variable and how you must actually account for that if you want to make a difference in women's health. Funding. Much of this can't be done without increasing the funding and new incentive structures to encourage investment in these areas and encourage what can happen here. We've all seen what the Orphan Drug Act did for rare disease, had huge impacts on the ability to treat many diseases that were previously untreated. When there is a concerted effort around a specific a specific agenda like this, huge progress can be made. This kind of ties into the last point too. Actions and policies that help women advance health is kind of a collective piece together that is required to make a difference overall on the $1 trillion opportunity. You might ask me, whose responsibility is this? We believe you. There's a huge opportunity. There's a huge burden that women face that we should be eager and excited to correct. Whose responsibility is it? Truly, there's a role for every stakeholder in the ecosystem. Academic institutions need to be able to get more research out about the women-specific differences that manifest in the data. Healthcare institutions need to be better able to serve women-specific conditions and treat women-specific diseases when women arrive in their care. Pharma companies and innovators need to put a concerted effort toward building a pipeline of innovation around these specific conditions. The policy ecosystem must support this innovation, and the funding mechanisms and the funding bodies that can help support this must be eager and excited to enhance the funding here. All of this collectively is what I hope I have gotten you excited about in terms of actually closing a $1 trillion opportunity. All of this data is on our women's health. You can scan the QR code. We have a report as well as a technical appendix with some of the details on how we built these calculations. Please also be free to reach out to us at womens-health@mckinsey.com. We're happy to share more about our research and what we put together. I would invite any questions, though, around anything on these topics. There's a couple mics around the room. I think I've heard that is the best bet.
Jenna, thank you very, very much. McKinsey has done a great job of capturing the GDP quantum. What about the more constrained in business case, which is what industry is going to be looking at, because it's not clear how much of the GDP case they can actually capture, and they are primarily driven by how much they can actually capture of this market. And do you have any plans as a firm to home in on the business case in addition to the GDP, which is great for policymakers and for governments, but not quite as helpful for business?
Thank you. I think overall, what we try to take is a macro lens to what could happen to a global health burden overall. What we've looked at is a couple of market opportunities, right, to give a sense for why pharmaceutical organizations or others in the life sciences space should be excited about this. I think a lot of where the market sizing, again, comes back to a little bit of this chicken or the egg. Market sizing is a lot based on, do you think you have a target that can address this issue in the market? What is the size of that issue? And what will it take to get there? Some of the issues I highlighted today make those business cases inherently a bit harder to build. We don't know the size of the burden for every one of these diseases because we don't actively understand the differences for men and women in these diseases and know what it would look like if we were able to solve it. We're starting to learn. There's a lot of advancement and opportunity there, and I think unlocking that piece would be a key to building these business cases more effectively. And on the flip side, in terms of helping pharmacos understand where to prioritize to solve these issues, it's about them having access to the data to understand what assets may be better targets or what platforms may be better for a specific manifestation for women. I think all of these pieces together, if we can help advance some of the understanding of those pieces and understanding of where the burden sits and kind of what are the pockets of greatest opportunity at a more granular basis, can help inform the next level of decision making around where to prioritize.
Great presentation, Jenna. I'm Simon Allen from EOF Bio. We're a small clinical stage biotech, and we're very passionate about endometriosis. And I wanted to make an observation, maybe highlight a disconnect, and then a very serious question. The observation on the 1 trillion, I think, is right on. The numbers we're tracking for endometriosis is a global impact of around $220 billion a year. And that's the same GDP as Switzerland. You look at $1 trillion a year, and that's like taking Australia out of the equation just for women's health issues, which is a huge impact globally from a financial side. The disconnect is, as we start to talk about the 200 billion for endo or the trillion for women's health, you look at the market size for endo right now, it's only about $1 to $2 billion a year, and yet it's causing 200, maybe $300 billion of economic impact. So I call that sort of the disconnect between what we're looking at as impact and a medical need and the amount of money that's being invested in it. It's not there, but I think the momentum's here. We're definitely on a rising tide. So with that disconnect becomes, I think, one of the more important questions, especially as it relates to endometriosis, is in the developed markets, there's only about 17 million women with endo right now. And they account for 90% of that $1.3 billion annual market. And yet there's over 160 million women in emerging markets that don't have access to this, treatments and solutions. And yet the unmet medical need is more apparent there. So the question is, how do we get investment, secure investment for non-economically attractive outcomes? Because if I go to VCs and say, look, I'm going to go to the emerging markets, my cost of goods is this, we're going to squeak the margin so everybody can have access to it, they basically roll their eyes and say, no, talk to me about the major markets where we can make some real money. And I'm like, well, that's good. I can see where you're coming from. But to me, if we were to be successful in treating endometriosis and the pain associated with it, I would like to think it's not just for 17 million women, it's actually for 183 million women, which is the numbers we're tracking right now. So the question is, how should we go about ensuring that as we develop these drugs, we're actually developing it for the world and not just for the people that can afford it? Yep.
It's a great point because, as you said, I mean, the numbers we shared, the numbers you shared, is a global disease burden. This isn't a high-income disease burden. When I think about the innovation here, I think it absolutely needs to get there. I mean, I think we still see so many challenges in just even getting to that first phase of what is the solution that's either going to treat in the high-income countries or in the lower middle-income countries. What is it? First, finding that, mobilizing that is a first step. I think it can often feel daunting when you think about how do you move a kind of innovative therapy through high-income countries to low-middle-income countries. What I would hope is we would see some kind of similar momentum to what you have seen in other disease areas. So I'm thinking of immunotherapy for an example. In 2000, I was just doing some research on a kind of a 25-year retrospective of the industry. In 2000, it was largely still a myth. Many people didn't believe immunotherapy was really going to change the world. And now what you're seeing is major IO therapies having access, at least in the middle-income countries today, and moving further and further into new-income countries. Now, the timeline, would we all like to see that compress? Absolutely. I think, though, what we can hope and ask for is that we can find the innovations that can support this global burden, and then find ways to make sure that makes it to greater populations. Because agreed, it's not to the point is to solve the global burden, the $1 trillion global burden, not stop at the size of Texas burden that you could get if you did it in some of these in some of the more niche but higher income countries here.
Geographically, is there a particular region in the world that's better at set up to innovate in women's health? Like Asia Pacific, Europe? Is there more innovation coming out from a particular region? Have you looked at that data?
So I would say what we know is that to the extent of even the women's health burden that we know is much better captured in higher income countries because it has a better rate of capture of diagnosis. So what we know is that if you think about the quantification that we've done, a larger share of that comes from the higher income countries, which is also a product of just we know better in countries like the United States when we have a condition like PCOS, like endometriosis, which may go underdiagnosed in other regions. For that reason, I don't know that there's any specific region that is better positioned to to innovate here. I think there's a lot of global innovation and global trial starts coming across disease areas in many different regions. I would imagine, though, that to be able to kind of get the flywheel moving with the access to treatment and access to care, I think we'll see the most kind of starting momentum in a region that already has traction around diagnosis, around the ability to treat. Hopefully that becomes not a question, though. I don't know how many years, but in a short number of years, hopefully we don't have to ask the question of where can we do this, where will the innovation be. Hopefully the answer is we're all there, and who's going to accelerate further.
Hi, great talk. I'm a PhD student, and I would love to one day research women's health in my own lab. And I was wondering if you know, of funding lines for specific research to women's health, and if you see them growing, because right now I feel like they're pretty non-existent, but especially with NIH and everything. But just where you see funding going for academic research based in women's health, I guess.
Congrats on your PhD. That's a huge accomplishment that you're working toward. I think funding has been that's one of the kind of points we raised that needs to continue to accelerate here. I think private sector is doing a lot. I'm looking at Anula because we talked a lot about this morning with what VC funding is doing for the space, and how even Google and others that might surprise folks are digging into women's health more and more. So I think from a private sector perspective, funding is largely there's excitement there. On kind of research funding, I think there's demonstrated traction of that. And I think some of the fact that this is a track even here today says that there's just an investment in advancing this forward. I think as we move forward into different political environments and campaigns, I think the goal is to kind of the idea is that hopefully funding will follow where the priorities for the biggest burden are. And it's clear that women's health is a burden that 51% of our population faces an outsized share of. And I think that's an area that will continue to be acknowledged and hopefully supported by the kind of academic research funding. In terms of specifically where that could come from, I think that tends to come from different areas and tends to be concentrated in specific manifestations of treatment, whether it's endometriosis, whether it's other care needs, but would hope that continues to accelerate.
Hi, Elizabeth Wagner. You had some data up there about, I believe it was 47% of the burden is kind of women disease being disproportionate to the men's, right? Mm-hmm. And then it seems like there's other data in the report, a lot of the assets in the pipelines, a lot of the funding are going towards the women-specific issues. So there seems to be a gap in those larger, like you said, asthma, arthritis. There's some things where it affects women differently. So what are the trends that you guys are seeing in the data collection and the movement to understand and treat women differently in those broader conditions?
And that's exactly right. So what you see is the 47% of women who are impacted disproportionately here. So that's one. So I think a couple things. So when I think about where the innovation needs to be tailored toward this kind of a sliding scale of how women-specific some of these are. The first 5% is women-specific. You hear a lot about that. I would say what you hear most about currently is movement in things like the women-specific conditions like endometriosis, like PCOS, and other reproductive care type of diseases is where you hear the most here in terms of innovation. The next phase of the first one is actually you need to treat this differently because it manifests differently in women. I think that's where that's where you see kind of the need to have new research and new data on what exactly drives those differences. I would need to look into specifics on exactly who's doing what there. What we know, though, is it's hard to start that without the data to explain what is driving those differences in symptomatic presentation. There's a lot of work underway to be developing the data around understanding that, which can then help start that innovation wheel around treating those. And then in terms of conditions that disproportionately affect women disproportionately, this is where it's not necessarily that it impacts women differently than men. So if you think, for example, autoimmune disease, this 47% isn't necessarily saying that an autoimmune condition impacts a man differently than it does a woman. A woman is just more likely to have that specific autoimmune disease here. This is where it comes down to, I think, a little bit less of the innovation and more around the understanding of what it means, what diagnosis looks like. This is where you see, when I talk later about access to care, underdiagnosis manifestations or kind of lack of understanding of how to diagnose may be more present in this 47. The innovation piece is very much concentrated in this kind of first 10% with a little bit in the 47, but then absolutely when you get even to this 10%, which is so very clearly women specific, there's still a huge gap between the rate of incidence for women and, the rate of incidence for those diseases relative to other well-treated diseases. Well, great. Well, if no other questions, I want to say I hope we have you all inspired to be a part of resolving and kind of advancing this $1 trillion market opportunity, part of the ecosystem that can advance the women in your lives, living healthier lives, contributing to GDP, contributing to their family, contributing to families, and contributing to communities. We hope to see you part of the next generation of change and kind of what makes this women's health gap close for women. So thank you.